dwelling place shall be yours and enjoyment for a while. Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Imran, for those of you who know the Qur'an will know this, but these are two very, very long chapters of the Qur'an. They're the second and third, respectively. There's a lot of structural parallels between them, and one of the interesting structural parallels is that this verse, where the primordial couple has this conflict with Satan and gets sent down, is in the exact same place in the surah, exact same verse numbers, as the story I just showed you about the wife of Imran. So when the wife of Imran bears this child, having dedicated it to this child to the service of the temple, it's a female child, which sort of goes against what would have been the custom for the Hebrews at the time. So in these first verses, you have to say, what is the relationship? If we know that there's a structural relationship between the two, what is the difference? So the Qur'an in the first one is responding to an idea, perhaps, of blaming women for original sin, right? And on the second one, it's responding to this perennial idea that we find across cultures that somehow a female child is not as worthy as a male child. And so I find that these are two ideas that have pervaded much of our cultures today, and very subtly in a storytelling manner, the Qur'an asks us to think a little bit deeper. So Hannah, or Anne, meaning from, in an Arabic context, favor or grace, to incline, tenderness, love, loving affection. I thought this would entertain some of you up here. You see the Arabic genealogy here for Yahya, John the Baptist here, and Zechariah. And then on the other side, the wife of Imran, Hannah, through Maryam, and then Isa. When the Qur'an, in Surah Maryam, which is the 19th surah of the Qur'an, the Qur'an tells the story of Zechariah and his wife becoming miraculously pregnant. And then in exact structural parallel, it tells the story of Maryam being impregnated with Isa, Jesus. So there's a way in which the Qur'an ties these two families really poetically together. So let me skip a little faster so we get time for question and answer. So Mary's mother, she says, "My Lord, I've delivered a female." And then, and it's not very clear if this is continuing her speech, or is this the omniscient narrator of the Qur'an coming that says the male is not like the female. And this verse has been, oh my goodness, interpreted so chauvinistically at different times in the Islamic tradition. Not in every commentary, but in several prominent commentaries. Meaning, and this, the female is nothing like the male, right, with that intonation. But the preceding verses, and I regret, I don't even think I put them on. Did I put them on? No. I need to insert a slide here. The preceding verses talk about the beautiful way that God raised Maryam in the temple, and it emphasizes ihsan, which is spiritual excellence. So if God was somehow, or if Maryam was somehow expressing disappointment in receiving a female child instead of a male child, it's definitely doesn't play out in the rest of the story. So rather than interpreting Mary's mother as being disappointed, I simply say surprised, right? Which is a perfectly plausible way to interpret the story. Nothing in these lines convey necessarily disappointment. This is, sorry the English is so small, I'll read it out here. This is one of my favorite verses of the Qur'an. I have about 500 favorite verses of the Qur'an, but this is one of them. This is the birth story of Jesus, which has an echo in the Christian tradition, and I'll tell you where in a second, but it's not a manger scene. It's under palm trees where Maryam's giving birth, basically alone, and the angel comes and tells her, shake the palm trees, the dates are going to fall under you, drink the water from the spring that's running right here. But Maryam, when she's in the throes of labor, says, the Qur'an narrates, and the pains of labor drove her to the trunk of a palm tree, and she said, "Oh, I wish that I had died before this and was a thing in oblivion forgotten." So it's this very accurate, can we say, depiction of the absolute, height of labor. And I just love that this verse is in the Qur'an, in Maryam's own speech, because even as we recite it in the mosques as we do, you have frequently male reciters kind of performing this speech of a woman in labor. And I think it's just this beautiful way in which the Qur'an itself calls attention to this very holy and very difficult act, which the Qur'an doesn't in any way name as a punishment, but does call a hardship, meaning something that is difficult, that must be endured. But in an Islamic paradigm, a hardship is something that brings about something that causes a person to spiritually develop and grow. So in another Quranic verse on the labor process, the Qur'an says, we, in the royal we, God, have enjoined upon humankind kindness to parents, because in pain did a human being's mother bear him, her, and in pain did the mother give birth. So it's considered one of the reasons for deep affection and respect for your mother kind of throughout life. I have a blog up on Oxford University Press blogs looking at the Christian parallel to the story of Mary being born under the palm trees. It is in some of the material that didn't make it into the canonical Bible, but it is in the Testament of James, as it's typically called. So I'm wrapping up now, but I did want to just draw 2 points of attention that although many of the Quranic figures do come from either the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Testament, there are many women who are drawn from the milieu of around the Prophet Muhammad, including one of my favorites, which is a woman who comes to the Prophet complaining about her husband, and God in turn comes with a verse in the Qur'an saying, "God has indeed heard the words of she who disputes with thee concerning her husband and complains to God, and God hears your conversation. Truly God is hearing, seeing." Okay, so this is what it looks like in the Mus'haf, in the Qur'an in print. And then the rest of the surah goes on to say how wrong the man was, and how the woman was absolutely right, and she had a valid complaint. So it takes this trope of a nagging woman, and is totally like, yeah, she has a reason to nag. So kind of my final lesson from the Qur'an is when women are nagging, they might have a very good reason. So thank you so much for listening. I do put my email up there because I like hearing from people. And I look forward to hearing your kind of questions, thoughts, comments, and we'll just dive right in.
Does the Quran say who Jesus' father was?
So in the Quranic understanding, and this is verse 1919 of the Quran. 19 is a very interesting number in the numerology sort of the Quran. And verse 1919 is where the angel comes and informs Maryam that God has said be, and it is, and Jesus is the Kalimatullah, the word of God, the Logos, that is a sign of the majesty of God. And Muslims understand that according to another verse in the Quran that says the likeness of Jesus is the likeness of Adam, meaning that there's an unusual form of their coming to being. And so Adam has no parental figure from the soil of the earth and God's breath. And then Isa is an example of a human being created miraculously without male genetic material or through some other means that I have no idea. But so it's a powerful story for Muslims as well. And that's part of the mysterious sort of identity of Jesus. Jesus speaks in the cradle when Maryam is accused of being unchaste in front of her people. they say, you're from this holy family, what are you doing with an infant and not having been married? And Jesus turns around and speaks from the cradle, or from Miriam's arms, or something like this.
We do have some time for some questions. And as you think about your questions, I have one I wanted to ask. And
just
we are
realizing,
within
is that
2 minutes.
correct? Okay.
We're within 2, well, it's probably better than my watch, so yes.
Yeah, I'll give a 5-minute
Within 2 minutes of
buffer just in
sunset, so
case.
you can move on for just 2 minutes. But one of the questions that it was on the slide you had the other day, they also had one of the early slides tonight where you had, we, God in parenthesis, created blah, 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 and you answered it a little bit towards the end there about God in that voice of the royal we.
Royal we.
But the question that kind of struck me was how similar that is to the Genesis opening thing, where it says, let us create humankind in our image, which obviously in the context of its writing 3,000 years ago was monotheistic. So I'm wondering if there's a parallel with that sense of the royal nature, the royal we nature of the holy between the two traditions.
I'm so glad you asked this question, because it brings me to one of these interesting points of dialogue circles, where it's kind of Christian, Muslim, Abrahamic dialogues. And oftentimes people will say things like, we are all children of God. And the Muslims are like, we're not children of God. We don't say that, So this question of likeness, and what exactly does likeness mean? And we don't have that expression anywhere that I've seen in Islamic texts. And in fact, we have almost a parallel opposite, which is Laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing like unto God. And so this is a very fascinating way in which our traditions are so interwoven, and yet on this profound kind of theological point that becomes so much of the basis, for Christianity, for liberal Judaism today, it's very, very different. And the other thing I'll warn you that's very different is there's no snake in the Quranic story of Genesis. And so I once went to a dialogue on this particular story, and the Christians, it was an Abrahamic dialogue, and the Christians and Jews are all off about why it's Eve's fault, and then talking about the snake, and the Muslim women are looking at me like, what are they talking about? So there's certain ways in the traditions are so very parallel, and then these obvious ways. But if we look at this manuscript, which does come out of an Islamic context, does it show up? Yeah, there it shows up. And this is, I'm guessing, I didn't put the attribution, but I'm guessing it's probably like 14th, 15th century, probably, Transoxanian, Central Asian, and you do see a snake, right? So in the popular creation, we do have the little serpent there. But you'll see also in the back there the peacock, which stands in for arrogance, because the story in the Islamic tradition, Shaitan stands in for arrogance, because when God creates this new human being, Satan is like, what is this human being created from material substance? And here I am, fire, created from smokeless fire. And so it's a story in the Qur'an that I've often heard preached in sermons about how arrogance is the downfall of Satan and of people. So it's fascinating. You have both the snake and the peacock, so both kind of ways of expressing the satanic impulse.
Okay, before you change that slide, I don't need a mic.
Well, mine
Now-
picked up my neighbors.
Now I'm going to be nervous. Okay, so before you change the slide, the one thing I love about this is they're standing together, because even in the Bible, and everybody misses this, they're standing right next to each other when they're eating the apple. It's not like he just comes along out of the dark like an idiot. So, thank you. And then I have several more questions, not questions, but observations. I've always kind of wondered why Mary was chosen as a name, Mariam. I believe in Hebrew it means rebellion. And then kind of, I remember now I'm losing my train of thought, but it kind of goes in with the other names there. And then it was curious to me that the name of Jesus is Isa, which in Tagalog, which has kind of commerce with Indonesian and Spanish, but it means one. So maybe that's where it came from.
So it comes, as I learned, from Yeshua, which is, we anglicized Jesus.
Yeah.
But Joshua would be maybe the closest parallel. That's what I've learned. Does that check out with other?
Yeah, I know
authorities?
Jesus is from Joshua, or
So which Isa is Yeshua.
Okay.
It's just a direct equivalent.
but it's curious to me that it comes and they use it for the number one in the language.
Good way to remember.
And then
I put up here, by the way, just on the bottom here, the
Yeah.
Zaytuna podcast. So Zaytuna College is a Muslim college, the only accredited Muslim college in the U.S. It's out in Berkeley, right on that holy hill. I know some of you have probably traveled that direction. Right next to the Graduate Theological Union, and actually it inhabits one of the old Graduate Theological Union buildings. And so this is a podcast, if you like podcasts, and in there I'm reflecting on this story if you're curious to hear more of the Islamic take and how, from a contemporary perspective,
Yeah.
we're interpreting the
oh,
story.
and they have all the good podcasts up there. Okay, one last question. I'm totally lost. The father in Christian context, Anne's husband is Saint Joachim, or Joachim. Who are you trying to point out as? Is it David? Were you talking about the lineage of David? You said something that would be obvious to people, and I was kind of
Oh,
lost.
here. Let's see. Is it this slide?
Yeah, it was like right before, and you were saying, oh, some people know who this is.
Yes, I was wondering if people could figure out, having maybe know, with their biblical knowledge, what that particular family
Well,
tree.
I knew that, I thought it was the lineage of David, but I don't know, Hannah or Anne married Joachim.
Mary's mother.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, and then on the other side, that's Elizabeth. That's my
Yeah,
name.
Ishla.
And then John, all that. Yeah, so I'm lost. Did you mean the lineage of David? Is that what you were trying to get at?
Well, this is eventually
Yeah.
would go all the way up. And David, Dawood in the Qur'an is a central figure in the Qur'an as well. And the Psalms are considered by Muslims to be a revealed scripture. So David is a prophet, much loved prophet king. Suleiman is also, I mentioned the Queen of Sheba. Suleiman is in that story.
Okay.
So those figures are
Okay,
definitely
so
in there as well.
But Imran is Joachim.
Yes,
Right?
I'm following your question.
Okay.
In the Christian tradition, Anne husband has a different name.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, so it's Joachim,
Oh.
which I always thought was a Muslim name, but curious if no, it's not, it's Hebrew. But
Oh,
So that's what
whereas
it is.
this is Imran.
yeah, Imran.
Right.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm getting it, okay.
I'm
Yeah, there's
always
been a
thinking-
lot of ink spilled by scholars over where this name Imran comes from, because some scholars think it's a misattribution of another, out of another context.
So it's not necessarily,
Yeah, this is definitely one of those names that doesn't pair up at all.
one of those mysteries. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Yes, please.
I know.
I was thinking, at the very beginning, when you were talking about like couples and spouses, I've been following you around this whole weekend, and I would love to hear your thoughts about like Quranic perspectives or your interpretations about same-sex relationships and
Oh,
what,
yes.
how you take these verses that are really gendered about couples, and so what do you do with that as Muslim, as a feminist, as a scholar?
Exactly. This is very, very hard, because as you've seen, probably the entire Quranic language is so bifurcated, and you have male and female, you have husbands and wives, and men and women, and there's no mention in the Qur'an itself of transgendered persons, although that comes very, very early in the legal tradition. And there's lots of affirmative language about transgender people in the legal tradition. But when it comes to same-sex relationships, it's one of the sticking points for why it's so difficult for Muslim communities to en masse validate same-sex relationships, is because the Qur'an is very, very heteronormative in the way it talks about marriage. And so, although in the story of Lut, which in many ways mirrors the biblical story, Lut is considered a prophet, and he at one point says to the mob, "Why do you incline towards men, when you have the daughters of the tribe, meaning the women of the tribe?" And so it's very hard to be grounded in the Qur'an in the ways in which Muslims are grounded in the Qur'an. You would have to move away from Quranic cosmology and move away from the idea that prophets speak with authority in order to, it's just so very hard to ground in a scriptural context.
Right.
And now other communities Christian Jewish communities, the progressive wings, have been able to say, prioritize other ethics. So an ethic of egalitarianism, or an ethic of dignity, or an ethic, love, whatever it is. But even Islamic ethics are so deeply tied to the Qur'an that it would be very difficult to take a system that's more or less a coherent system and then introduce an anomaly into it and have that accepted in mass. It's just, and it's not, I think, the important thing when it comes to this issue is to realize that this issue goes to the very heart of the entire episteme of how we derive authority in Islam. And so it's not a simple matter of like individual opinion. It's goes right to the heart, and that's why it's so very difficult. And so a lot of times the difficulty for someone like me doesn't come out of a personal animus, doesn't come out of I wish it were simpler to be able to reinterpret, to make more accommodating. And it's just very, very difficult to do without compromising kind of very, very core tenets. So that's where we're left. There's no easy way through. No easy way. This, by the way, is one of the reasons when I talk to younger people who no longer affiliate with Muslim spaces, this is one of the reasons that they give that the Islamic tradition, as writ large, cast large, is not accommodating enough. So it is a pressing issue that we have to figure out how to get through.
Do you know of any scholars or books that are tackling, that either